All right, Texas approaching the midway point of conference play, so it's time for a little midseason grade session. Professors Yarrish and Henry here with you on the Horns 24/7 YouTube channel. Thanks for stopping by. Eric, good to see you as always. Let's go ahead and grade some of Texas's players, but we'll start with Texas's head coach, Rodney Terry, in year one. I'm going to start off here by giving him a C plus. I think there's a lot of noise right now about, oh, Rodney Terry needs to be fired. And I think it's just way too early for all of that kind of talk. I don't think that we're even close to that territory yet, Eric, because he has had some good wins. It's year one with a roster that lost so much from last season. And he's competing with good teams here in the Big 12. You saw that 4-point loss to Houston in overtime, where they looked down and out of it after the first half. They come all the way back to force that game into overtime. No moral victories, obviously, but I think that was very impressive. And then big wins against Baylor and Oklahoma on the road. I think just continue to prove why Texas is building something. Eric, your thoughts?
Yeah, with RT, I'm going to go with a C. And here's the reason why. I think it's tough for a lot of fans kind of to process and swallow some of the Big 12 losses, right? I think that's probably the hardest thing to really swallow, really fathom. You take a look, going against a Big 12 newcomer, UCF, you hold a big lead, you lose that one. Texas Tech, obviously a rival, you don't want to lose that one, So if the West Virginia game, that's a team that was 5-10 at that mark, you lose that one. I think if you get different results in those games, then maybe you feel a little bit better in my mind. But the biggest reason why I think you have to go a little bit C here, and then I'm not buying to any of the Rodney Terry getting fired talk. He's almost through, midway through the Big 12 slate of his first year. This was something that you had to know in my mind there were going to be some growing pains. But his management of the roster, of the rotation, is something that, while if you talk with RT, he said, hey, you want to use a non-conference time to really figure out what this roster, what this lineup rotation could look like. But some of the things that I think you're seeing as far as implementations, and we'll get into some of the guys who are being mix and match in the rotation, are things that I feel like you could kind of tell even from the onset of the season, right? And still you have to take account, in my mind, for injuries. DeSue wasn't available the entire time. Same with Caden Shedrick. But all in all, I think a C, still room for improvement, and we'll see how it fares in the second half of the Big 12 schedule.
Yeah, completely agree. There's still plenty of room for improvement, but I think this could go a lot worse considering just how good the Big 12 is from top to bottom. Now we're going to move to Texas's biggest newcomer this year, and that's Oral Roberts transfer Max Abmas. Eric, I'm going with A- here. I think when Texas landed Max Abmas, they knew that you're going to get that scoring pedigree. You knew that he's going to hit his averages in the scoring column every night. But I think the reason I give him a little bit higher of a grade, and maybe he surpasses expectations a little bit, is I think he's somewhat held his own a little bit more defensively than I thought he would. I'm not saying he's an elite defender by any means, but he's been able to play much better defense than I thought, at least considering how good the guard play in the Big 12 is. So for Max Abmas, I'm going with A- here.
You and I are landing on the same spot. I'm going A-. It's funny, you're taking the defense into account. I'm going offense. And I know that sounds a little crazy for a guy who's on the top 15 in terms of all-time scoring in college basketball. But the question in my mind, Tommy, was legitimate. Going from a mid-major on Oral Roberts, now going to, playing Texas, the Big 12, the nation's toughest basketball league. How would he fare being somewhat of a smaller, diminutive guard in terms of he's never looked like he can't get his shot off. He's always found ways to get his shot off. And to me, that was a question, especially being a smaller guy and playing against bigger guards. How would the length affect him? It hasn't been an issue at all. So I've been very impressed with Max Abmas. On the defensive end, I think he is what he is. You've been a little bit impressed with his defense. I think he's had moments. The biggest one that kind of comes to mind has been Pop Isaacs. When they needed a big stop defensively down the stretch in the second half of that Texas Tech game, Pop Isaacs just took him down the post and kind of did what he wanted to. But all in all, to your point, Tommy, I would agree that he's never looked completely overmatched for the duration of a game. So A- is where I land.
Yeah, that's good grades there, Eric. Our next guy, you talked about him a little bit earlier, missed a big part of the season during the non-conference slate, but I think he's come into conference play and played really well for Texas, and that's Dylan DeSue. I think he's picked up right where he left off at the end of the tournament last year, so I'm giving him an A. I think he's provided a huge jolt for this Texas team since he returned from injury, because the way I think about it is, Eric, what would this Texas team look like if Dylan DeSue was still injured? Would they even have a win in Big 12 conference play if Dylan DeSue was still out, considering, you've got Caden Shedrick, who's been dealing with injuries all year long, essentially eliminating all of Texas's size. So I think he has been a complete game changer for Texas. And when he's playing well, it's very difficult to stop them. So I'm going with A with Dylan Disu.
So I understand your reasoning why you go A, because you're certainly well within your own right to say that Texas would not have won the 3 Big 12 league games that they have had they not had Dylan Disu. I'm going to grade him just based on what I'm seeing out there on the court, and I'm going with a B. Here's the reason why. Again, and not saying that Dylan is anything of his own doing. He's coming off of injury, but you can tell he said that he wasn't on a minutes restriction and just outside of the LSU game. But I think it took him a little while to get his basketball wind, get up to playing, north of 20, 25 minutes. That's step one. Step two, he needs to kind of get out of foul trouble a little bit. Somewhere that the past few games, he's been around that 4 mark, even almost, I believe he fouled out 1 game this year, if memory serves me correct. And you got to be on the floor to make an impact in crunch time. That's certainly something that, again, they don't win the Big 12 games that they have without his presence. But all in all, just grading him and across the board like I'd grade anyone else, I'm going with a B. But that doesn't mean that his impact has not been felt. And also, I'm probably being a little bit hard because we know that Dylan Disu, once he gets everything underneath him, is a guy who's easily capable of being the second best player on this team.
Hey, we've all had harsh professors before, right? So that's totally valid, and it's okay to have differentiating opinions. That's a very good take. I liked your point about him not being fully up to speed. I think in that Houston game, it was mentioned on the broadcast that when they talked to Dylan Disu, he said he didn't really feel like he was fully back until that Cincinnati game, and that's right at the start of Big 12 play. So we had already kind of been ramping up for quite some time. So again, that's a completely valid take. Next up, we're talking Tyrese Hunter. I've said from the start of the year that Texas goes as far as Tyrese Hunter goes, and so far he's been very inconsistent. So I think for that reason, I'm giving him a C+ here. If he's in double-digit scoring, more often than not, Texas is winning games and they're playing really well. When he's playing fast, when he's attacking the basket, and when he's got his shot going from beyond the arc, and he's filling up the stat sheet in the scoring column, Texas more often than not is going to win you games, but he just hasn't done that all year this year. And you could even argue they didn't do that at some points last year too. So for those reasons, I'm giving him a C+ here, Eric.
I'm going B-. I was torn between, B-, C+. I understand the reason you go C+. The reason I go B- is you take a look at his shooting percentages. They're up across the board. So clearly, as a scorer, as a shooter, he is improving. Now, certainly not as consistent as you would like, to your point, Tommy, but as you mentioned, on the defensive end, everything we heard coming out of camp was that Tyrese Hunter has an opportunity in terms of his skill level, his talent level, to be an all Big 12 defender. Well, he has not been that night in and night out. You can make the argument. There's another guard we'll talk about in this portion as we run down the players who are giving grades, who's been a better defensive guard than Tyrese Hunter has. So that's the thing in my mind, being consistent on the defensive end. And he's a guy who's very clear. When he's at the peak of his game defensively, that turns into a higher, more productive Tyrese Hunter on the offensive end. So for that, I'm going to go B-. Again, I go a little bit higher than you only because it's clear, especially his 3-ball has improved from last year. His overall field goal percentage, true shooting percentage have improved as well. But still want to see a little bit more from him on the defensive end.
Well, you mentioned the guy who has been playing really good defense at the guard position for Texas, and that's Kendall Weaver, the second to last player that we'll talk about here. I'm going B+ here, Eric. I'm not going higher just because I think we still need to see more from him, considering he's so new to the 20+ minutes a game mark. I think it's only been 2 or 3 games where Rodney Terry has entrusted him that kind of time. But when he's gotten that kind of time, I think he's played very well. And granted, you still have some of those growing pains for a newer player that we've seen at times with turnovers and some lapses on defense and some missed shots. But he provides a huge, I always call him the Energizer Bunny that comes off the bench for Texas. I think you mentioned Rodney Terry's rotation struggles when we talked about his grade. I think that you've got a solid rotational piece coming off the bench there for Rodney Terry. He's played very well defensively. You saw him completely take Jamal Shead out of the game towards the end of that Houston match where Shead was basically scoring at will up until that point. So I've been very impressed with Kendall Weaver and, part of the Kendall Weaver hive, if you want to call it that. But still, I think there's room for improvement, as there usually is for new transfers like that.
Listen, certainly room for improvement. However, I'm going to give Kendall Weaver this grade based on, in my mind, what we believe the expectations were for him entering the year versus where he is now. And that's an A- in my mind, because I think when you look at the role that maybe RT and the staff kind of envisioned him in, it almost felt a little bit similar to Zarek Onyema in a sense of, hey, we're getting a very raw, talented guy who's making the jump from a mid-major to now the best basketball league in America. And let's see what he can do, right? And in fact, with Kendall, the fact that we're now having a conversation about him possibly needing to be in the starting lineup or at bare minimum being part of the group that closes games. We saw that against Houston, that it was as far as guards was Max Abmas, Tyrese Hunter, Kendall Weaver closing the game. In my mind, that's exceeding expectation. That is higher return on investment and return on value than what you expect in there, in my mind, even to the point where Kelvin Sampson said that he is clearly the best defensive guard on this team. Offensively, certainly still room to grow, very much a raw talent, someone who, almost sometimes feels a little bit out of control when he penetrates. I can't talk about the amount of times that I've seen Kendall Weaver, Tommy, that elevator doesn't quite reach as high as he thinks it is as far as going to dunk and having, making a putback play. But still, all in all, I think when you get a guy who penetrates to the basket really well and is a good driver, and that shot will come along as well. But just in relation to what you expected coming into the year, I'm going to give him an A-, Tommy.
Yeah, in regards to his shot, he was one of the better shooters across Division I basketball last year at UTA. So if he can kind of tap into that a little bit, then you could see maybe a point guard of the future for this Texas team. And he really can jump out of the gym sometimes. It's a lot of fun to watch. The last guy we'll grade here is Dylan Mitchell. I think him coming back was huge and deciding not to go to the NBA, getting some more work and to develop his talent. I'm going to go B- here. Maybe that's a little bit harsh, but you get your double-double from Dylan Mitchell, which I think is really big. And I think he had arguably his best game as a Longhorn against Houston, where he kind of came into the second half and was a big reason why Texas was able to fight their way back into the game. But I would still like to see him contribute a little bit more on the defensive end, just because his athleticism is so good that he should be a guy who sends a lot of shots back, in my opinion. And, sometimes his frame limits him a little bit in the low post. And you kind of knew that coming in with him, just because there's not a lot of muscle that you can put on that frame. But nonetheless, that's kind of why I go a little bit lower. But overall, I think he's still a very important piece of this team, Eric.
Tommy, I'm going B- as well, because he's also a little bit like Tyrese Hunter. He's been somewhat inconsistent. When you get the best of Dylan Mitchell, and I asked Rodney Terry post-game after the Houston game, when you had a stretch there in the last 10 minutes of that game of regulation, of course, that game went to overtime, when Dylan Mitchell's putting back-to-back buckets and, grabbing, 10 points, a couple boards, a block, a steal. That's the best of Dylan Mitchell and what you can ask for. But you've also seen moments where he's a guy who's 6'8" and very athletic and jump out the gym, only getting 4 rebounds, and he's someone who he hasn't even developed that consistency as a rebounder and is second in the Big 12 in rebounding, averaging over 8 per game. So you want to see them just bring that energy, that tenacity, something that Dylan has talked about, his calling cards, defense and rebounding. Bring that every night. Be that guy who leads Texas every night in rebounding, and also want to see that shot come along a little bit more. He kind of takes that free throw line elbow jumper a little bit, and it's not necessarily the most consistent shot. Most of Dylan's points right now are sort of coming on dunks and putbacks and things of that nature. So I want to see that offensive game come along a bit. But again, it's just tantalizing Texas fans, Tommy, because when you get the best of Dylan Mitchell, you feel like it's a guy who he lives up to every bit of the 5-star recruit he was coming out of Mountain Verde. And at times when he's inconsistent, it's like, man, you just want to see more.
No, absolutely. Hit the nail on the head there, Eric. So report cards are in. They've been shipped off and they're away. Now we kind of slide over and take a look at Texas's resume. And we're still a couple weeks away from Selection Sunday in regards to the tournament. But right now, let's see where the Longhorns stand. In quad 1 victories, quad 1 games, the Longhorns are 3-5. They split in quad 2 and quad 3 at 1-1 apiece, and undefeated 9-0 in quad 4. As of this recording, they're 40 in the net ranking and 35 in KenPom. So, Eric, for the most part, and most bracketologies as well, Texas is still in the tournament, still kind of on that bubble, but they're in the tournament. Do you think that's going to hold by the end of the season, considering what they have coming up in their schedule?
Tommy, I'll admit, I thought going into this 6-game stretch where they were going to face 6 ranked opponents. Now, of course, some of those teams have kind of fallen out of the top 25. So right now it's just 4 straight. And I believe heading into TCU, they're unranked. But still, I thought this stretch would make or break Texas's season. The fact that they've come away with 2 top 15 wins, almost came away with a top 5 win, that's huge in my mind. Now, does that give enough confidence down the stretch to say, hey, once we get through, we still got to face Houston one more time. That's going to be certainly a challenge. They're going to go to Waco and face Baylor. But once they get through this murderer's row of just top 25 teams or top 25 caliber teams, can they, win the games they're supposed to win? Tommy, I do think there's room for an 8-10 Big 12 team to make the NCAA tournament. Can that be Texas? Most certainly can. I think there are 5 Big 12 wins are left remaining on their schedule. So where's that land them? We'll see. But I do think if they reach 8-10, not even 9-9, 8-10, I think that gets them in.
Yeah, Eric, I think that's the right thought process. Here's kind of the jarring number for me. Maybe not necessarily the counter, but they've got 10 games remaining. 6 of those games are quad 1 games. 5 of them are on the road. Texas has struggled at times on the road. We saw it at BYU, and then they had arguably their best game of the season against Oklahoma, so you could argue that as well. But when they have gone away, it has been a struggle at times for this Texas team. And the teams that they are playing away now, like you mentioned, Houston, Baylor, they have to go to Lawrence to play Kansas, who has struggled, and Texas has played very well against Kansas in the past. This is still a really good Kansas team with Hunter Dickinson, who at the top of my mind, I'm trying to find someone on the Texas team who can be a good defensive matchup for him for 40 minutes. So I'm kind of on the fence here a little bit. I think we still need to see a couple more games to develop a full opinion. You know, they got TCU coming up on Saturday. Then they host Iowa State. TJ Otzelberger's got the Cyclones rolling right now. They're number 12 in the AP. But I think it's cutting it very close, Eric. I do agree that, you know, an 8-10 team could make it in from the Big 12, but I think they would have to have a really solid performance in the Big 12 tournament too to be able to really solidify their spot. So like Texas, I'm kind of on the fence right now. And Eric, honestly, I think I might be leaning to the Texas doesn't make it at this point in time. But there's still a lot of room in the season for Texas to improve their resume. And as of right now, I think it is a good enough tournament resume to get in. But that's all stuff to just watch unfold as we go on throughout the season. So make sure you stick around at horns247.com. Eric's got every game covered for you on there. Eric, Jeff, and Chip, we all are on there to make sure that you guys have the best coverage of Texas men's basketball as we head closer and closer to March Madness. We'll see if the Longhorns can get in. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Horns 24/7 YouTube channel. While you're here, be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and turn on post notifications so you're the first to know when new content heads your way. For Eric Henry and the rest of the crew, I'm Tommy Yarrish. Appreciate you stopping by, and we'll see you next time.